G'day everyone and welcome back. It is so cold here this morning, but it should fine up to be a nice sunny warm day, and it's a perfect day for working on the bus. So this weekend my dad is actually available to help me do the lining on the ceiling because it's going to be a bit of a tricky job and it's definitely requires more than one person. So we're going to make a start on that. So the area of the ceiling that I'm going to be covering with the boards is basically this middle section here. So underneath the insulation, I've got those two timber battens running the length of the ceiling on either side, and I've got the other ones above the window sill, and that's what my overhead cabinets and things will be attached to. So a lot of this section on the edges you won't actually see because it'll all be behind built-in cabinets. So the area of the ceiling that I'm going to be doing the shiplap is just this section in between here. So there's only a very slight curve there because we're basically avoiding the really steep curve on the sides by doing it this way. So hopefully it won't be too difficult to attach the boards. And these are the boards that I'm going to be using. It's just your standard shiplap kind of shape that they're cut, and these ones are actually 5.4 meters long, so one board will go the whole length of the bus without having to do any joins, which is nice. And they've come already primed. So I'm going to be painting my ceiling white, so this was perfect. So the primer is already done. I have gone ahead and sealed on the underside of these. I've actually put 2 coats of clear varnish. So this is the face of the board that'll be touching the insulation and be screwed up in against the batten. So you won't see this side, but I wanted to protect it a little bit more from moisture. So I've given all the boards 2 coats of clear varnish on the underside. I'll paint the top coats when they're installed in the bus. So I was originally going to use tongue and groove pine lining boards to do the ceiling. There are a couple of reasons why I ended up going against that. First of all, at my local Bunnings or any of the Bunnings in southeast Queensland, you can only get those boards in 2.4 metre lengths, which would mean that you'd have to kind of stagger them in the ceiling and there would be joints visible between the planks. I didn't really want that. So in order to get, like if I wanted to get the 4.8 or the 5.4 metre lengths that would go the whole length of the bus, I was going to have to get them from another timber supplier, which was going to be a lot more expensive, whereas Bunnings had the 5.4 metre option in the shiplap pine. The other reason that I thought maybe the shiplap would be a little bit better is because the tongue and groove is just a little bit more fiddly to get the boards to lock in together, and the tongue little, like the groove that's cut out of the boards is actually quite thin and flimsy and it breaks quite easily. So I just thought, whereas the shiplap you just have to overlap it, you don't actually have to try and fit that like a tongue into the groove the whole way along the board. So again, I just thought maybe it would be a little bit easier to install, and I've seen a lot of other people use the shiplap boards to do the ceiling in their vans and their buses, and it looks really good. So that's why I decided to go with that. It's finger jointed pine, it's not like solid pine the whole length, so I think it should be okay. It's about 12 to 13 mil thick, and they seem pretty strong, so I think once they're up and it's all painted, hopefully it'll look nice. Well, the ceiling is done. It actually went up a lot easier than I was expecting. I've seen people have all sorts of dramas trying to put up their timber ceiling, but I was pleasantly surprised to discover just how easily it went up. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I was using shiplap and not tongue and groove, because I think it just makes it so much easier. And I'll show you what I mean, because I've had a few questions about the difference between tongue and groove and shiplap, and I think people get confused because people often refer to tongue and groove boards as shiplap when they're technically not, and there is a difference. So I've got some scraps of board here. So this is tongue and groove board, and I hope you can see this on the camera. The reason it's called tongue and groove is because each board along one edge, you can see it has this narrow bit that sticks out on the side, and that's the tongue. And then on the other edge of the board is this groove. And the idea is the way the boards join together is that the tongue of one board clips into the groove on the adjacent board, and that's that's how they join together. And I was almost going to use these, but the issue is, as you can see, that this tongue, especially on these boards, which are only 12 millimeters thick, and this is just pine, the tongue itself is very thin, and also the edges on either side of the groove is very thin. So it's very easy for these to break and sort of crack and chip off. Especially when you're trying to fit these boards to a curved roof and having to tap them in and so on. So I think that's where a lot of people have trouble, is just it's very fiddly to get these boards to connect, especially when you've got a board that's 5 meters long on a curved roof and you're trying to get this in, you know, nicely along the whole length of the board. Whereas shiplap is a little bit different. So I've just got some scraps of the shiplap board here, and you can see that it's cut sort of more square, and it's cut in such a way that adjacent boards just overlap each other like that. So you're not trying to fit a tongue inside a really narrow groove. You can attach one board and then the next board just sits over the top of it like that. So it's a lot easier to join the boards together, and I think it also makes it easier when you're dealing with a curved roof, because even, you know, if the boards are having to be on a slight angle, it's not placing any strain, like you can see on the tongue and groove. If you have to put the boards at an angle, it's immediately kind of putting pressure down on that really thin tongue, and that's again where it can break really easily. Whereas you don't really have, if I put this up the right way, you don't really have that issue with the shiplap because it can just bend like that. So I think that made it a lot easier. We also had a pretty cool system in place with using supports that we made, which helped to hold up the boards so that both Dad and I could have our hands free to support the area that I was screwing into and so forth. And I'll just show you how we did those supports because it worked out really well. So basically all we did to make these supports was use 2 pieces of ordinary framing pine. So this is just framing pine 70 by 35 mil that you can easily get at Bunnings. And we've got 2 lengths of it. The one length is about 1.5 meters, I think we cut it to. And the second length is a little bit shorter. And on the short length, you can see we've just wrapped an old towel around the end, taped it up with duct tape so it's pretty secure. That's just to give a little bit of cushioning and padding so when this is pressed up on your boards, you're not marking them too much. And so basically the way it works is the 2 pieces just get clamped together with a couple of G-clamps, and by loosening and tightening the clamps, the height is adjustable. So this second piece, if I take these off, you can basically slide this second piece to wherever you want it and so adjust the height, because obviously the roof is curved, so the height will vary depending on which board you're trying to support. So by doing it this way, we were able to just adjust the height of this to wherever we need it, tighten the clamp so it's nice and secure, and then push this under whichever board we were needing to hold up. And with 2 of these, that was more than enough to do the full length boards that are going the whole length of the bus. We were able to put 2 of these in. That was enough to hold it up in place, and then Dad and I both had our hands free to work on the boards. So really simple idea, but super effective and just made the job so much easier. If you're using supports like this, you could probably almost do it yourself. I mean, I managed to get the very outermost pieces in by myself yesterday after Dad left, just using the supports. It was a bit awkward and tricky to get them up at first, but then they held them in place while I was able to do the rest. So it is possible, I think, using supports like this, especially if you had 3 of them, might even be a bit better to do this on your own. But obviously if you've got somebody to help, it does make a huge difference, makes the job a lot easier. So the way that we went about it was first to find the middle of the ceiling, because I wanted to make sure that I lined up the join between the first 2 boards with that center in the ceiling. Now, most of the videos that I'd seen where people have done this kind of thing on their ceiling, most people start by putting one board centering, so the middle of that first board lines up with the middle of their ceiling. Now, I didn't do that purely because of the width of the area that I was covering with my boards. Well, I'm not doing the full curve of the roof. I'm only covering really the center section of my ceiling with these boards. I'm not going all the way down to the tops of the windows like a lot of people do. And so with the width of the area that I was covering, it wasn't exactly equal to like a whole number of boards. I was always going to have to cut the outer two most boards to fit in that space. And if I'd started by just putting a single board in the center of the ceiling, it just worked out that by the time I got to the edge, I would have been having to cut like on a flange. You would have seen a little bit more of the flange visible. It was just going to be a bit messy with where I would have had to cut and then later on trimming over that to fill the gap. It actually worked out better for me to start with, instead of putting a board in the center of the ceiling, to start with putting the join between two boards in the center, because that meant when I came to the edge, and it was time to cut that last board, it was sort of being cut in the middle and just looked a little bit nicer. So that's the way I did it. It might be different for your roof. If you're covering a greater area, then the boards may fit in to that space a little bit better, and you may end up not having to cut any of them at all. But I highly recommend just cutting a whole bunch of little short pieces like this so that you can put them up on the roof and get a sense of where they're going to come to and see if you do need to cut any, because I mean, that just worked for me. So what we did was we first measured where the center of the ceiling was, and I just did that by, making a few points, measuring from the same part of the frame in the roof along the whole length. And ideally, if you've got a chalk line, it would be good to mark that center line with a chalk line, but we didn't have one of those, so I just used my straight edge to join up all the dots that I'd made. And so then we had a line that was dead center in the ceiling. So then what I was able to do is put two of my little sample pieces together so I could see where that join was going to be, line that up with the center line, and then mark another line out from that, the width of the board. So I had the center line first, and I used that to line up the join between two boards. And then I marked the second line where that first board would come to, and it was that second outer line that we used as a guide for lining up the first board. And so that's how we got the first board into position and got it as straight as we possibly could. So it's really important that when you're doing this to take your time with that first board, because you want to get that as straight and as dead center as possible, because if it's not going straight down the middle, then as you're laying subsequent boards, it's going to become more and more noticeable. And then by the time you get to the end, you're going to have the problem where you've got, you're having to cut a board because one end's, has to be wider than the other to fit it in. Even all the time we took to do that, and it looked like it was dead center with all our measurements, when I came to do the very outermost boards, they were actually out by about 10 mil at one end. So there was some slight variation there. You can't really notice it when you're looking at the roof, but if we hadn't taken as much time to try and get that board as centered as possible, then the difference might have been noticeable at the end. So take your time to get that first board as straight as you can, because all of the other boards are going to be lined up according to that. Once we had that first board in, it was just a matter of each subsequent board measuring the length that we had to cover, cutting the board, and putting it up. We used those supports as we were bringing the board in just to help hold it up while we got it into position, and then got a piece of just scrap pine and a rubber mallet and just put it on the edges of the board just to tap them in so that they were nice and flush. And then once we were happy that the board was in position and it looked like the groove was sort of fairly uniform along the whole length, then it was time to screw them in. Now, the way that I did it, if you'll remember, you might have seen in my previous videos, I had actually installed timber battens in the ceiling, so along all of the metal beams across the roof, I'd actually screwed in pine, 42 by 30 millimeter pine that I attached alongside all the roof beams. So when it came to screw up my boards, I wasn't screwing into the metal frame of the bus, I was actually screwing up into these timber battens that I'd installed. And these are the screws that I used, countersunk timber screws, 8 gauge, 40 millimeters long. You might obviously use a different size depending on what you're actually screwing into. Remember, I'm screwing into my timber battens that are 40 millimeters So I needed the 40mm screws to get through my ceiling boards, a little bit of insulation, and then this gave me a good probably 20mm into my timber battens. If your battens are only 19mm, which I've seen a lot of people use, then obviously you'll need much shorter screws. These boards are pretty solid, like they're 12mm thick. Actually, I think these boards are 13mm thick, and they're pretty solid. And for the most part, where I was screwing was, you know, pretty much in the center of the board, so well away from the edge. But even so, I didn't want to get any splitting at all of the pine. So in order to prevent that, I actually pre-drilled all of the holes. I just used a very small 2mm drill bit just to get a tiny little pilot hole to take some of the pressure off the screw, and I drilled up through the board and up into the timber batten. And then I used a countersunk drill bit, just countersink those holes a little bit, because you're most likely to get splitting of the wood when the heads of the screws are going in. So by countersinking the hole, you're just giving that head of that screw just a little bit, it's not putting so much pressure on the wood as it's going in. So I pre-drilled with the 2mm bit first, then I used the countersunk bit just to countersink the hole, and then I was able to screw these in. And I just made sure that I didn't do them, you know, with too much force as I was screwing them in. And by doing that, we didn't get any splitting at all, which is good. Even in the sections at the very ends and in some places around the fans, where I had to screw quite close to the edge of these boards, by doing that it prevented any splitting. So I highly recommend. Again, it takes more time, but I think it's worth doing. Now, we actually made a pretty big mistake when we were installing the ceiling boards. As you can see here, we did all of the full-length boards on one side of the middle, and then what we did was we started installing the full-length boards on the opposite side. And you can see there's actually a gap in the middle where that fan is. And what we should have done was filled in that gap with the short pieces first and then continued laying the boards on the opposite side. But luckily, because I was using Shiplap, I was able to put these 3 pieces in without having to take boards off on either side, because I was able to slot the first board in and then so on and so forth. And because this final board here is just overlapping the flange on this one, it's not having to tuck into a groove or anything, I was actually able to put it up. Now, if that was tongue and groove, we would have had to take all of the boards off on one side to do this section and then redo the ones on the other sides. So I guess that's another plug for the Shiplap, but I don't recommend you do that at all. I recommend you pay more attention than we did and do it right the first time. But yeah, we definitely would not have been able to fix that as easily if we were using tongue and groove. So we were able to get all of the full width boards up while Dad was around. And then I was able to come back and just install the 2 outermost boards by myself. It was a little bit tricky, but with the help of the supports that we'd made, it was actually manageable on my own. And they went up pretty well. And you can see with these boards on the very outer edge that I just had to cut them because there wasn't enough width for a full board in the space I was covering. So I just got my jigsaw and just cut along the whole length of the board so it was wide enough to just tuck up in there. So that's how we did it. And as I said, it went up surprisingly easily. And I'm really happy with how it's turned out. I mean, obviously it's not finished. I've now got to go and fill in over all the screws, give it a good sand, and then it's got to be painted. But obviously I'll do that at a later stage. But for now, I'm really happy that the ceiling's installed and I can get on with the next stage of the build.